to the cloud. Everybody should get a little pop-up on their screen. And here we go. All right, so welcome everybody to the latest in the Unitarian Church Forum series. We have today Professor John Cropper from the College of Charleston History Department with us to talk about Omar Ibn Said, whom I suspect people do not know a great deal about, but is a really, really interesting figure, and I think really complicates people's simplistic understanding of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and so on. So John is one of a super smart set of young historians at the College of Charleston. He's been at the college since 2019. He started off actually as a European specialist with a BA in European history and French culture from Colorado College. And then he moved into the social sciences and into African history at the University of Chicago, one of the top graduate programs in the entire country, where his dissertation covered environmental history and specifically the politics of energy production in French West Africa. His book, Fueling the State, Energy, Politics, and the Environment in Senegal from 1450 to the present day, is in progress. And he's also at work on a project on renewable energy in colonial Senegal. So when the Spoleto people came to the College of Charleston looking for somebody who could actually tell them something about Omar Ibn Said and the background to somebody like Omar Ibn Said, we knew exactly who to pass them on to. We passed them on to John Cropper, and you will find out why we did that in just a second, because John is going to tell you all about Omar Ibn Said. So thank you very much, John, for being here. Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's change the screen save or the share function here.
I might have to stop mine.
Yeah. Okay, let me pull up my slides. Just one moment, please. I feel like the more we do Zoom as teachers, the worse I get. Maybe it's just like a subconscious aversion to the screen now. Okay. I think. Okay, just one moment. Okay, we can all see this now. Okay, great. So I'm going to have to keep it in this kind of less formal slideshow because I'm going to kind of move back and forth between the notes that I had for the talk as well as the presentation. Okay, well, thank you, Simon, for that incredibly warm welcome. I really appreciate it. And I'd just like to thank you, of course, for inviting me here today. And I really appreciate the warm welcome that you've all shown me thus far. So today we're going to discuss Omar Ibn Said, who, as you probably know, right, is the subject of a Spoleto opera, which is scheduled for the spring of 2022. Of course, it was meant to be spring 2020, but with COVID and the pandemic, it's been delayed about 2 years. I've participated in a few roundtable discussions on Omar and his life and the connection between West Africa and Charleston. And I'm really excited to be able to have the chance to do this again with you today. It's a wonderful topic, and I hope that we have a great discussion after I'm finished with the brief talk. So before we jump into, let me get that there. Before we jump into a more in-depth discussion, I'd like to give you just a very quick background on Omar and his life. Omar was a West African Muslim from the Fouta Toro region of contemporary Senegal. So if you look on the map here, it would be, so this is all in French, of course. This is a French pre-colonial map of the Senegambia region. But if you look in the top right-hand corner where it says Deful, that is the Fulbe ethnic group, as we call them, and that particular region right there is where Omar was born and where he lived. And so Omar was born in what they believe 1770, and he was a part of a well-educated and elite class of Islamic scholars, and was likely a member of the political ruling elite in Fouta Toro. In 1807, he was enslaved in a battle or perhaps a military skirmish. And then he was sold into the transatlantic slave trade by his political rivals. And he was transported to Gadsden's Wharf here in Charleston, in I believe maybe late 1807 or early 1808. In Charleston, Omar was purchased by a local plantation owner, a man with the surname Johnson. That's about the extent that the archives allow us to know about his initial master. And he worked as a cultivator of Carolina gold rice for his first few years here in the Low Country. After being severely mistreated, his master at the time was a very violent man. Omar escaped Johnson's plantation and traveled north to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he was captured and then re-enslaved until his death in 1864. So right kind of at the beginning, or I guess in the middle of America's Civil War. And he was quite old. I think he lived to be 93 or 94 years old. So at first glance, Omar's story seems quite unremarkable for an enslaved African in the 18th and 19th centuries. Like so many victims of the transatlantic slave trade, he was captured in battle, sold to European slave traders, and condemned to a life of plantation labor in the New World. However, what makes Omar's story so remarkable is that in contrast to the vast majority of Africans who were enslaved, Omar was a literate, well-educated Muslim man who spent the first quarter of his life studying with prominent Muslim scholars in the Futu Toro region of contemporary Senegal. As an enslaved person in the United States, Omar rarely, if ever, discussed his past. And it was not until his imprisonment in Fayetteville that he revealed to his captors, and he did so by writing verses of the Quran on the prison walls, that he was in fact literate and could read and write in Arabic. In spite of his lasting devotion to Islam, however, Omar converted to Christianity in 1820 and was regarded by his master, Jim Owen, as a very good and faithful Christian. Yet Omar's conversion to Christianity was, in a sense, perhaps half-hearted. As his writings and autobiography demonstrate, his faith became an entanglement or perhaps a hybrid of his previous life as a Muslim in Africa and his new life as an enslaved Christian in North America. While there are many aspects of Omar's life that we could obviously discuss here today, I would like to focus on Omar as really the quintessential example or representation of the fluidity and dynamism of the Atlantic world, and how African, Caribbean, and North American sensibilities created a vast array of religious, political, social, and cultural entanglements. In doing so, I would like to push us to engage these entanglements by noticing their legacies, for better or for worse, in Charleston and throughout the Low Country today. So in other words, I want us to think of Africa and Charleston as deeply connected worlds that were not separated, but rather connected by the Atlantic Ocean. Today, we will explore these connections and historical legacies by focusing on Omar's homeland, and then tracing his life from pre-colonial Senegal to the New World. Futu Toro itself is situated along the Senegal River in what historians refer to as the Middle Senegal Valley, right? So going back to this map here, again, if you look at the Roya de Foul, that is about approximately the length of the kingdom of Futu Toro. Let me find my place here again. The state of Futu Toro, in this here picture is a photo I took of the Senegal River Valley while I was doing field work in 2015. The state of Futu Toro stretched along a narrow corridor of the Senegal River, and it spanned 250 miles from east to west and only about 15 miles from north to south. So it's quite a small kingdom, but it was also one of the bread baskets of the Senegal Valley, so the fertile land in this region was hotly contested. And at the time of Omar's birth in 1770, the Senegal Valley experienced a volatile period of political, economic, and climatic instability. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, the French and British fought over access to and control over the Senegal River and the fertile fields of Futu Toro, which seriously disrupted trade between Omar's homeland and Saint Louis, which was the commercial hub located at the mouth of the Senegal River Valley, which again, if we go back to the map, the Saint Louis, which you can see here on the Atlantic coast, was the very first trading post of what you could say the early French colonial empire in Senegal. Okay. Let me see. Along with the disruptions to trade, a series of droughts and famines pushed rival states to the brink of starvation. These states, including the Wolof and Berber kingdoms, raided the villages and communities of Futu Toro for the grains and enslaved populations that worked the land. So in the late 1770s and early 1780s, extended periods of drought led to an increase in slave raiding, and in a span of few months, a British officer recorded that 8,000 people were captured in Omar's homeland of Futu Toro and sold into slavery. So this particular instance, when Omar really arrived on the scene, was a very volatile time in this particular region of Africa that was enmeshed within what we call kind of a transition from kinship slavery, which is kind of a more benign form of slavery in Africa, to chattel slavery, which then really became kind of the hallmark of plantation slavery in the New World. So scholars who study slavery in Africa have constructed a wide variety of interpretations on the processes of capture and enslavement. To make things simple for all of us, I'm going to offer just a very brief narrative of how the institution of slavery in Africa, and perhaps even the slave trade's early years, that sorry, just one second. I keep losing my place going back and forth between these slides. So I'll just repeat. To make things simple for all of us, I'm going to offer a brief narrative of how the institution of slavery in Africa, and more specifically in Senegambia, changed over time. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, and perhaps even during the trade's early years, the majority of African pre-colonial states, including those in Senegambia, practiced a form of kinship slavery, which essentially required an enslaved person to assimilate into a master's household. Usually captives of war, or less frequently the victims of the raiding and pillaging of political rivals, enslaved people often lived and worked in the same manner as their masters, and it was not uncommon for European slave traders or Africans to mistake a free person for an enslaved person. Moreover, enslaved people could become rich and powerful. Some served as political clients and consultants of the ruling elite, while others served as soldiers and generals in the military, which in Senegal were known as Chedo warriors. And here you have a picture in the slide of a Senegalese Chedo warrior of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Many of these Chedo warriors possessed slaves themselves and accumulated wealth and power throughout the course of their lives. So in other words, being an enslaved person in Senegambia was not one's defining characteristic. It was just one piece of a much larger identity. Indeed, enslaved people were socially and economically mobile. They could marry and have families. They could earn money and accumulate wealth. And many even possessed more privileges than freed persons. However, their status as an enslaved person also meant that they could be bought and sold. So even though slavery in Africa was seemingly more humane than the chattel slavery of American plantations, enslaved people always knew they could be bought and sold at the drop of a hat. And so here we have a picture of the famous Door to Nowhere on Gore Island, which is off the coast of Senegal. And this particular walkway here opens up to the Atlantic Ocean, and presumably that's where enslaved people within this fortress would board ships and go on to the slave trading vessels of Europeans. You probably, if you've seen any photos of this, it might include Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and George W. Bush. A lot of heads of state in the United States take a moment to reflect on the atrocities of the transatlantic trade here in Gore Island. So by the 18th century, kinship slavery, this more kind of humane version of slavery, changed as the transatlantic slave trade reached its apex, with more than 6 million Africans being captured and sold to the New World throughout the 18th century. Attracted by the economic possibilities of profiting from the slave trade, many pre-colonial states in Africa tailored their economic systems to the demands of European slave traders, and thus created a much more predatory and violent form of slavery. In Senegal, the slave trade promulgated a widespread sense of insecurity that aggravated social conflicts and created a prolonged period of economic stagnation. So the predations of the transatlantic slave trade then pushed the pre-colonial states of the Senegal Valley into a series of wars and internal conflicts that at times provided large quantities of enslaved people for European traders. In response to the increase of slave raiding and the development of a more predacious brand of enslavement, a devout group of Muslim elites in Futa Toro, known as the Torobe, started an Islamic revolution that aimed to protect local populations from the predatory practices of the slave-holding Wall of Kingdoms. In the same way as the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, local populations of the Senegal Valley spearheaded a movement to change the oppressive social and political structures of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Similar to the revolutions of Europe and the New World, local populations in the Senegal Valley aimed to throw off the yoke of tyranny, abolish the institution of slavery, and seek out a more egalitarian society. Although historians of the Atlantic world have long argued that Europe, Africa, and the New World existed within a fluid and dynamic network of economic, political, and social structures, they have overlooked the role of these Islamic revolutions in what we call as historians the Age of Revolutions. And what I want us to think about in part today is to think about how these Islamic revolutions in the Atlantic world, or in West Africa in particular, were part and parcel of this broader Atlantic world history. So in a small way, we can say then that Omar Ibn Said's life underscores or provides a real connection to the fluidity and dynamism of the Atlantic world. So as this transatlantic slave trade reached its peak in the 1780s and 1790s, these Islamic elites, people like Omar Ibn Said, offered refuge to villagers, farmers, and peasants that were vulnerable to slave raids, processes of capture, and at times famine, which oftentimes swept through the Senegal Valley during the 18th and 19th century. So by educating local populations in the traditions of the Islamic faith and preventing their fellow Muslim citizens from being enslaved, these elites ignited a revolution in the Senegal Valley and installed an imam, or a leader of the faith, and constructed a strong army of Muslim warriors that protected and expanded the territory of Futa Toro. So for about 20 years in the late 18th century, the imam, a man named Abdul Qadir, consolidated power by appointing the educated elites, people like Omar Ibn Said, as the governors, or perhaps even the constables of these various territories throughout the Futa Toro kingdom. And so here in the slide, you can see a sketch, you could say, or an engraving of the Futa Toro army that protected local communities from the predations of slave traders and political rivals. So although Futa Toro experienced a brief moment of stability under the imam and under the protection of these Islamic elites, people like Omar Ibn Said, the 18th century became extremely destabilized as the transatlantic slave trade became more predatory. So by 1797, when Omar was just approximately 30 years old, the Wall of States of Cayor, so if we go back to the map real quick, the Wall of States of Cayor and Walu, these are the kingdoms of the Senegal Valley that were the rivals of Omar Ibn Said's political state, is to the left here, kind of close to Saint Louis. You see the Wal du Brac, you see Cayor right here, this kind of Cayor. these kingdoms were what we would call kind of slave societies, in the sense that almost everything they did, whether it was agricultural labor or trade, came back to the institution of slavery. And so the Wall of States of Kayor invaded Omar's kingdom, you could say, or the kingdom of Futu Toro in the late 18th century. And they did so by a scorched military or a scorched earth military campaign. And after a series of military campaigns in the early 19th century, Futu Toro collapsed, and a number of local oligarchs centralized political and economic control, and people like Omar Ibn Said became vulnerable to capture from political rivals, people like the kingdoms of states like the kingdoms of Walu and Kayor, or the Wall of States, we could argue. So according to some historians, Omar Ibn Said was captured and sold into slavery during one of these military conflicts, during one of these military campaigns. And as was typical with most captives of war, Omar was likely traded to San Luis and boarded a slave ship bound for Charleston in approximately 1807. It is likely that Omar fell victim to a wealthy class of mixed-race slave traders in San Luis, known as the Señores. So here you have a photo. I think this image is one of the most interesting we have from this particular time period. We have an image of the Señores of San Luis. So these were mixed-race women who really were the movers and shakers of the slave trading economy in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And you can see this woman kind of in the foreground with a lighter skin. She's obviously the Señore, dressed in these very elaborate clothes. And the woman next to her in the slide is probably one of her enslaved servants, we could say, people that ran her household for her. And these women gained a lot of their wealth not only by trade from San Luis with the interior, with the Wall of States, but they also at times married French colonizers, right? They married French traders who oftentimes died of malaria or yellow fever or other diseases. And so they would inherit all of the wealth of their deceased husbands. So over time, these women would accumulate large amounts of capital. And like I said, they were kind of the movers and shakers of this slave trading society in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So as a young adult, Omar Ibn Said witnessed an explosive period in Senegal's history. And of course, as we all know, he eventually would fall victim to the transatlantic slave trade and experience the horrors of the Middle Passage, and would have to endure the hardships of plantation slavery in the United States. Yet his life is not simply a sad tale of an enslaved African uprooted from his homeland and transported across the Atlantic to the New World. He is, in my view, more than anything else, an example of how Africa, the Caribbean, and North America were more than a melting pot of race and ethnicity, but a deeply entangled world of religious, spiritual, political, economic, and environmental knowledge. As Africans were forced to live and work throughout the New World, they brought with them a vast array of knowledge that continues to shape the way we live today. So, of course, as an environmental historian, I am, of course, attentive to the ways that enslaved Africans shaped our local landscapes here in the Low Country, for example. So here in Charleston, we can see the legacies of African knowledge, people like Omar Ibn Said, who traveled across the Atlantic Ocean and were enslaved on plantations. And you can see how their knowledge not only shaped our landscapes, but really left legacies for us to see in our contemporary world. And one way that we can see this, of course, is in the practice of rice cultivation. So in 1670, when the first settlers arrived in South Carolina, they possessed enslaved Africans that knew how to grow rice. And one of the things they did first and foremost as enslaved people was they grew their own subsistence crops. And many of these enslaved Africans in the late 17th century likely grew a form of hill rice that was perfected in West Africa and brought to the Low Country. So by 1690, these early settlers of the Low Country cultivated vast quantities of rice. And it's no coincidence that white plantation owners adopted a crop that West African enslaved populations could grow relatively easily and had the knowledge to do so. And as rice became a valuable cash crop in South Carolina, its cultivation shifted to the higher yielding inland swamps. And over time, the more productive yet time consuming system of floodplain rice growing was not only really lucrative, but it actually was kind of the exact replica of certain rice producing societies in places like Senegambia, places where Omar Ibn Said were from. And so if you look at this particular slide, of course, which is a very well-known advertisement for enslaved populations, you can see here you have the Windward and Rice Coast. So here we have people who traded slaves to Charleston advertising enslaved populations from rice-growing regions in West Africa. And so it was known that if you could get people like Omar Ibn Said or people from Senegambia, they could easily transition from the agricultural life of West African regions that cultivated rice, and you could bring them across the transatlantic, or bring them across the Atlantic Ocean, and they could clearly grow rice in the marshlands of Charleston. And let me get to the last slide here. So we are all quite familiar, of course, with the importance of rice in Charleston's history and how Carolina gold rice served as the foundation of the plantation economy. Yet I think what is important for us to do is to move beyond the simplistic narrative of rice cultivation's past and to understand it not just as a commodity that enriched white plantation owners, but as a form of African knowledge that white plantation owners used and exploited to accumulate wealth and power in the New World. And at the same time, we should also understand how enslaved populations, people like Omar, were not just the victims of the unfortunate souls of the transatlantic slave trade, but they were dynamic historical actors that shaped and influenced the worlds they inhabited. So even as an enslaved person, Omar exercised his agency as a human being, blending the religious worlds of Islam and Christianity, and demonstrating how the inhumanity of slavery did not make him less of a human being. Okay, so with that, I am finished with our brief talk here. I tried to incorporate quite a few different aspects of his life with some historical background, so hopefully it was clear enough for all of you to follow.
Thank you, John. That was fantastic. No, very, very clear. Really enjoyed that. I've got a whole bunch of questions and comments of my own. So I might actually start off with one or two of those as people also pop their questions in the chat.
Should I keep the screen up, Simon?
No, let's go to gallery view, and maybe if you ask a particular question, you can go back to
perfect.
Go back to that. Yeah. I think it'd be nice for folks to be able to see each other. So you talked about the Islamic Revolution there in the late 18th century, and I often, when I'm teaching, talk about the way that the Haitian Revolution has dropped out in that story of the revolutionary era. It's perfectly plain that the folks in the Haitian Revolution were absolutely aware of what was going on in France and what was going on in colonial America. But is there evidence to suggest that those Islamic revolutionaries were drawing on the same kind of rhetoric, or was it entirely inspired by stuff coming from the East, from Islam?
Right. So this is a fantastic question, because I think it kind of gets at the heart of what scholars who study pre-colonial Africa and pre-colonial Senegal in particular are really trying to understand. And so, of course, with something like the Haitian Revolution, we have very good archival evidence of the kind of dissemination of, liberté, fraternité, égalité, and this kind of spread of Enlightenment liberal ideas throughout the Atlantic world. And Senegal, it's a lot more difficult, right? Because there really just weren't writing systems that you can draw from people like Omar Ibn Said. I mean, of course, he spoke and wrote in Arabic, but most people did not. And so scholars that study this, and I've dabbled a little bit in this in both my teaching and just in my own work, there really isn't any evidence that these kind of like Enlightenment ideas settled in the Senegal Valley and inspired them to revolt. But it is kind of a coincidence in a sense that you have a group of people in the interior of Africa fighting against similar processes of tyranny and authoritarian style governments. And so I would assume that just like in Haiti or anywhere else in the Atlantic world, word had spread, right? We oftentimes think of the Atlantic world in the 18th and 19th centuries as kind of disconnected. But I think what scholars of the Atlantic world want to encourage us to do is to think of this as a highly integrated, highly entangled ecology, we could call it. And so I think that we could say that there were educated Africans that understood what was happening in Europe. I think it would be foolish for us to assume that they were cut off from the different networks of the Atlantic world. So I guess, the short of the long of it is we don't really have evidence that demonstrates that, but I certainly would not discount the fact that through oral transmission, right, through oral histories or just people talking, people understood what was happening more broadly in the Atlantic world. Yeah. And this didn't just happen in Senegal. So if you look at most of West Africa in the late 19th century, you have a series of Islamic revolutions that continued well on into the 19th century. So Futa Toro is actually just one example, but if you go further into the interior, contemporary Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad, you have what we call the Sokoto Caliphate, which is this massive pre-colonial African state that really initiated a revolution designed to throw off the yoke of enslavement in Africa at that particular time. So as the slave trade became more predatory, as I mentioned in my talk, you start to see the response of Muslim elites and other Africans who are really trying to end, this system that more or less, people say underdeveloped pre-colonial Africa to an extent.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And I would say even in Southeast Africa, you've got the history of the Mfakane, which is the rise of the Zulu kingdom, which used to be seen just as purely sort of anti-colonial and local nationalism, but people are now conscious that that is also connected to the depredations of the slave trade on the Southeast coast. I've got a question here from Paula Caffey. So Paula, if you'd like to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, sorry. Took me a while to get the button. Anyway, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm not camera ready, that's why my pick is up. But I found the way you left off, well, I enjoyed the entire presentation, but the way you left off, I found really intriguing. And that is there anything in the archives that talks about some of the specific activities and especially leadership activities that Omar Ibn Said undertook across the ocean? Because you're right, he's the same person. He's a leader and a protector. And so is there anything that discusses how he tried to do that amongst fellow Africans in this new situation?
So you're talking here in the New World.
Yes.
So sadly, there isn't that much out there about Omar in his specific time and place. We have his autobiography, which you can all find, of course, on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or preferably at your local bookstore. And he writes, his autobiography really is a tale mostly about Africa and then coming to the New World, but he really doesn't talk too much about his life as an enslaved person in Charleston first, and then of course in North Carolina. And in North Carolina, he was removed from plantation labor, so he became an enslaved person that I don't even know how we might want to categorize him, but they understood that he was above agricultural labor. He was a well-educated, very intellectual human, and so they encouraged him to write his life story while an enslaved person. So maybe the best way to answer this is that while there might not be evidence that he took leadership roles or protected people within his community as as he was doing in Futu Toro before he was captured, but just offering the voice of an enslaved person and offering that experience is in a sense a form of agency, a form of leadership, you could say, simply because that voice has been silenced and actively silenced for so long. So I think the fact that we can even have a Muslim scholar, which we don't see that anywhere in the archive in the Atlantic world, to provide an account of his life is beyond invaluable, right? It's a remarkable story. And it also sheds light on kind of what we would say the African Muslim diaspora that came out of the transatlantic slave trade, which is a very understudied topic. And I think with people like Omar Ibn Said, that is gaining a lot more momentum. And so I think it's encouraged all of us to pay more attention to processes of enslavement and capture and being traded to the New World, and how Muslims themselves kind of ignited different communities. So I guess the leadership might be residual, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I use that very loosely, but I appreciate that. Agency is probably the better word. And just to kind of cap it off, because, you know, he is one individual, but he's emblematic or representative of, again, a number of people who are just, you know, deemed invisible with no agency whatsoever. So thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question.
Nancy, I see you have a hand up. So if you'd like to go ahead and ask a question, and then we got a question from the Nakunai after that.
Yes, hi there. I'm Nancy, and I'm fascinated with geography. And my stance, and probably you know this, Simon, since you teach African history, is that Americans do not know geography. So when you refer to Africa, it's a country. Well, it's not. So I'm fascinated with Senegal, and I'm more fascinated with Cameroon, another French-speaking. My daughter spent 2 years there in the Peace Corps, and so we visited her there. And so my question: are all the French colonial, you know, Cameroon is more, I guess it's officially Central Africa, but I'm wondering, is it similar? Was the slave trade and the process similar in all of French-speaking Africa?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer as well, so right on. Not in Africa though. I was in Albania, very different place. My first, you know, kind of initial response is the experience of trading enslaved people throughout the French Empire was very, very different from colony to colony. Senegal, for example, really was kind of the epicenter of the transatlantic slave trade in the early 17th century. But over time, enslaved populations were actually kept by the political elite of the Wall of Kingdoms to grow agricultural goods for the slave trade. So Wall of Kings, of course, would sell enslaved people when they needed to earn extra money, to put it crudely, I guess. But by and large, you know, what we can see in the archive in the 17th and 18th centuries in Senegal is a transition from really being the center of trading to actually being the center of commodity trading, I should say, in terms of staple grains, things like sorghum and millet that they use to keep enslaved populations alive in Saint Louis and Gorée, and then to sustain them on their voyage across the Atlantic. And so as you know, the transatlantic slave trade progressed, which is, you know, remarkably a 350-year process, you start to see a shift southward and closer to places like Benin, Togo, Sierra Leone, right on the Bight of Biafra, you could say, and then down through equatorial Africa, where you see Cameroon. And at this time, right, like Cameroon, I don't even, you know, I'd have to check, you know, I don't specialize on equatorial Africa, but I would be surprised if it was actually kind of deemed a French colony at that point. It was more exploited at that time by the Portuguese and by the Spanish, actually. And so on that part of the Central Atlantic African coast, you have the vast majority of enslaved populations being traded by Portuguese traders who then made the quick trip to Brazil, right? Because it's a lot closer. So they rarely would go up, to the Caribbean or to North America if they were trading further south and further south in the continent, you could say. So I think we don't really see Cameroon becoming a French possession until sometime in the 19th century. And then, of course, with the scramble and partition, you see that happening in the late 19th century.
Yeah, my understanding actually is it was a German colony, and so World War II.
Oh yeah, that's true.
So,
that's
yeah.
true. Yeah,
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, although only after 1884, right, when it was divided by the British and the French and the Germans. So it was difficult. And I think also people, one of the things people fail to remember about the slave trade is that the slave trade to continental North America was relatively small, only about 500,000 actually shipped in the whole period to continental North America. And you got 10 and 12 million going to the Caribbean and to South America. So another question from Diane or John Narkunis. And they're busy unmuting, I hope. No, not yet. Here we go.
So I assume that there are attempts made by the slaves to practice their Muslim religion. And I wonder how successful was there a successful underground effort? There's very little in colonial history about the Muslim religion being any part of our country's growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, and I mean we do have an American historian in our midst this morning, so she could possibly chime in, Sandy, if you're available. But from what I can tell, there really is very little in the way of evidence or archival records of enslaved populations that were of the Islamic faith here in the United States. And there might be a few reasons for that. One, those types of enslaved peoples were, of course, silenced and were put in these positions where they might have kind of felt completely disconnected from their faith. And then as a survival mechanism, perhaps in the way that Omar did, right, converted to Christianity to be perhaps more strategic about survival than anything else. But the other factor in this is that a lot of these kingdoms that became slave societies, some of them were in fact Muslim societies, but they just didn't capture other Muslims because that's against Quranic law, right? So a lot of the Africans that were captured oftentimes were not people that practiced Islam, and they were sent into the transatlantic slave trade, and they practiced what other kind of animistic or traditionalist kind of form of spirituality or religion that they practiced. So it would be really difficult, I think, for historians to kind of tease out the actual data of how many Muslim enslaved people were transported across the transatlantic slave trade. But I think it would be strikingly small compared to the overall number of people that were shipped across the Atlantic. So I don't know if that really directly answers your question, but I think as in the way that we try to tease out really unclear data with very few records, this is kind of the way we can deduce the populations of enslaved people and their faith and their ethnicity. Mm-hmm.
I see Sandy's put in the chat, you're exactly correct, John, exceedingly rare to see evidence of Islamic practices in the American African diaspora. So we're getting fairly close, it's 10:45. Maybe one question from me, John. I've never actually been to West Africa, but I've seen plenty of film footage of the Senegal River, the Gambia River, the Sierra Leone River, and you're an environmental historian, and it's often been extremely striking to me how similar topographically those landscapes are to our coastline here with the low country, with these winding estuarial rivers and so on and so forth. Any comment on that? And did Omar Ibn Said sort of comment on climatic sort of disorientation, or was he actually, you know, in some ways quite at home in this landscape? Did he make any comment on that at all?
In his autobiography, and it's, you know, I read it maybe a year or two ago. I can't recall any serious comparison between the Low Country and the Senegal River Valley. But it must have been striking to him as well, right? Because where he's from in Futu Toro, like I said, is a very fertile region of the Senegal River Valley, and it floods. Well, it used to flood every single year, and so they had a two-tiered system of agriculture where they would practice floodplain agriculture. So when the waters receded, they could quickly sow their seeds, and it would grow in the fertile soil of the floodplains. And then they would, above the river, right, where the, you know, it's a bit elevated, it's quite flat out there, but it's pretty elevated in certain areas, then they would kind of grow the more traditional rain-fed agriculture. So they had actually 2 growing seasons, which is very unique in the arid Sahel, right, just below the Sahara Desert. And that's how they sustain themselves for most of the year. And that's also why they were such a contested territory, because very few places in this area had such rich grain stores. So I'm sure that Omar, I mean, I don't know if we can say he felt at home as an enslaved person in the Low Country, but you know, in terms of climate, yeah, it's very similar. And, you know, kind of on a very unrelated note, you know, I've met several Senegalese here in Charleston over the last 2 years, and they say, you know, we love it here because it reminds us of home in the sense of climate and humidity. And, you know, they'll say, I moved to New York and I had to get the hell out of there, and I came down to Charleston. and then I'm in an African climate, they say.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wonder, you coming from Colorado and Chicago, coming to South Carolina, having done research in West Africa, I wonder whether you actually sort of felt, oh yeah, this looks kind of similar. This looks African.
Yeah, and interestingly, right now, it being spring, you know, I'll wake up and just like smell the air, and it reminds me of Dakar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had a number of West Africans, when I'm bringing them in from the airport, coming down Rutledge Avenue, and they go, oh, this just reminds us of colonial West African towns.
Yeah, I mean, if you ever, any of you have the pleasure of going to Senegal, you know, if you go to a place like Saint Louis or Gorée Island, these are the really old kind of colonial holdings, and they look like, you could say, maybe disheveled versions of New Orleans. You know, there is this amazing kind of universal architectural experience in the French Empire in the 17th and 18th century. So all of the architecture is basically kind of you know, different iterations of itself all over the world. So it's pretty interesting. And if you get a chance to go to Saint Louis, I think that's probably the most fascinating example of this kind of consistency and environment throughout the Atlantic world.
Well, thank you so much. It's got to 10:49, so I'm going to have to close it down. I see a few thank you notes going in the chat, which is wonderful, and hands being waved all over the place, which is absolutely terrific. Next week is Easter, so we will not actually have a forum, but on the 11th, we've got Greg Garvin coming in to talk about conscientious investing. And then after that, we have Cyrus Buffum talking about Gadsden Green again. That means if it's Easter next week, that it's got to be Palm Sunday this week, and it is also Passover. So happy Palm Sunday and happy Passover if you guys celebrate either of those things. But in the meantime, thank you very much indeed, John. This was absolutely terrific. Have a good rest of the day, and I'll see everybody around. Thanks.